All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's Lux executive briefing titled Milligrams to Megatons, following the innovation journey of CO2 capture and utilization. My name is Yuan-Shen Yu. I'm a managing director here in the energy group at Lux. And today it's my pleasure to introduce your presenter, Renil Dalia. He's a senior analyst here in the energy group here at Lux Research. His primary focuses are in the decarbonization of industry, and you're going to hear a lot from him today about some of the great research he's been doing around carbon capture and utilization. But before we get into the presentations, a quick little intro on who Lux Research is. All right, very quickly and briefly, Lux Research is a strategic advisory firm focusing on emerging technologies. We use our analysis technical expertise, a methodology derived around primary research, and our advanced analytics platform to help you check and track the latest innovations. And specifically, within the energy group here at Lux, we focus really on sort of what is happening in the global energy landscape, specifically around trends and new innovations in technology and business models. But I think that we all know we need to decarbonize. We all know we need more renewable energy and things of that nature. But I think last year was a very big deal for us all. Last year, the world saw a snapshot into what the future energy system would potentially look like. One with dropping demand in oil and gas, one with increasing renewables penetration in the grid, and one with lower CO2 emissions and so forth. And really last year validated a lot of these theories and projections and scenarios that we've been talking about for decades. And while, yes, the world went through some social and economic turmoil, this was a really major turning point for the energy industry as commitments started pouring in from the world's largest economies to decarbonize over the next 2 to 3 decades. And really, to capture these changes at Lux, our energy team has focused on 4 key themes that we believe will be driving the energy transition to the next phase. Those 4 themes are, sorry, a little technical difficulty here. Those 4 themes are the evolution of electricity networks, decarbonization of industry, the business of the energy transition, and future energy for mobility. I won't go into too much detail about these 4, but I do want to highlight that today's presentation falls into that decarbonization of industry theme, where the conversation about how carbon and energy use in the industrial sectors remains one of the hardest decarbonization challenges for us as a whole. And many of the technologies needed to fully decarbonize are just under development or only just coming out into the commercial world. And one of those technologies specifically is CO2 capture and utilization. And today, Renil Dalia will present on that. And with that, I pass it over to you, Renil.
All right, thank you, Yuan-Shen, and good morning, good afternoon to is it working properly now, or?
Yeah, I have your audio here, Renil. Attendees, apologies, we're having some technical difficulties.
Is the audio working properly? Okay, so it seems that everyone can hear me. It seems that everyone can hear me, so I will go on. But if you cannot hear me, please let us know in the chat and we will fix the issue. All right, so today we're here to talk about carbon capture and utilization and looking at the innovation journey of CO2 utilization and how the space has evolved over the past decade. Now, why is CO2 capture and utilization important? Now, last year, Japan announced a target for carbon neutrality. The target said that the country will need to mitigate all of its emissions by 2050. Now, this is a very ambitious target, given how carbon-intensive Japan's economy is, but as well as the rest of the world, many countries have announced targets for carbon neutrality. Now, focusing on Japan, let's take a look at how big the carbon problem is for Japan. Now, what you can see on the figure here is the evolution of CO2 emissions of the Japanese economy over the past 20 years. Now, you can see that emissions are starting to decrease as from 5 years ago. It's not a very big decrease, but it's a slow and gradual decrease. But what's important to see is to look at where are the emissions coming from. Now, most of the emissions of the Japanese economy today is from the power sector. Now, in that sector, the energy transition is, we know what technologies are needed for the energy transition. Over there, it's renewable solar or electricity. And then you have emissions from the transportation sector, where decarbonization there will be led by electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles. And in the building industry, it's via the electrification of the building industry or decarbonization of the gas grid. The big problem is really the industrial sector. Now, industrial sector is reliant on the combustion of fossil fuel for high temperatures. For that sector, it's very hard for them to decarbonize because you cannot simply electrify the industrial sector because you cannot reach such high temperatures with electricity. So for the industrial sector, they will continue to be reliant on fossil fuel or at least a carbon-based fuel to reach these high temperatures. So for that sector, they will continue to emit CO2 emissions, which is why carbon capture as a technology is very important for that sector. Now, looking at carbon capture, there's a misconception in the industry that carbon capture is a technology that is not yet ready to be deployed at the commercial scale. And yet, as you can see on this market map here, you can see that there are many companies today, more than 20 companies, that can provide you with a carbon capture solution to capture and mitigate your CO2 emissions. Now, some of these companies are at the laboratory scale, but many of them are already at the commercial scale. Mitsubishi, for example, BASF, Shell, can all provide you a carbon capture solution that you can deploy within a year. But despite the fact that you have an array of companies that can provide you carbon capture solutions, there aren't many carbon capture projects around the world, including in Japan. Now, why is that? The reason why you don't see many carbon capture projects is because of cost. At the end of the day, it will always come down to cost. Now, CO2 emissions, they are a waste. You don't make money from a waste. And with carbon capture, it costs a lot of money to deploy a carbon capture facility. Now, if you're spending a lot of money to build a carbon capture facility to capture your waste and then bury that waste underground, you don't make any money from this business model. The only way to make money is if the carbon tax is higher than the cost of capture. Because if that is the case, then the government will be giving you money for capturing and burying your CO2 emissions underground. But as you can see on the figure here, when it comes to the industrial sector, carbon capture is not cheap, it's quite expensive. For power generation, the cost of capture is hovering at around $100 per metric ton of CO2. For steel making, it's slightly lower. For cement, it's slightly higher. But overall, you can see that you should expect a carbon capture cost of at least $100 per ton of CO2. Now, carbon taxes around the world vary widely depending on the countries that you're in. In Japan, in particular, the carbon tax is very low, is much too low to incentivize carbon capture product. And this is the reality with carbon capture. As long as the carbon tax is less than the cost of capture, you will never be able to make money from carbon capture and burying the CO2 underground. So this is where CO2 utilization comes in, because if you cannot capture CO2 and bury it underground, what you can do is you can convert that CO2 emission into a product and then sell the product onto the market and make money from the sale of that product. So this is a new area of CO2 mitigation that's being explored at a much greater intensity over the past 2 or 3 years. As the world seeks decarbonization, it seeks to find a way to capture this emission and make money from that CO2 emission. Now, looking at the broader CO2 utilization space, you can see that today there are 6 different types of product that you can make from CO2. These are concrete, chemical, fuel, polymer, carbon material, and finally a protein material. Now, over the next few slides, we will look at the evolution of these technologies, and we will look at the advantages and disadvantages of each of these technology, and finally highlight which technology would be best in the Japanese context. Now, what we'll do is we will look at the timeline of the progress of CO2 utilization. We have our 6 different products, and then the scale of development from the lab scale to the commercial scale. Now, if we go back 20 years, 20 years ago in the year 2000, you only had 3 companies with publicly disclosed projects in CO2 utilization. Those were Mitsui Chemicals and SAIC in Japan, making methanol and polymers from CO2, but you also had Empower Material, a startup in the US, also making a polymer from CO2. So 20 years ago, not much activity in CO2 utilization. We jump forward 10 years, you can see the number of companies that were formed to develop and commercialize CO2 utilization technologies. Now, all of these companies, most of these companies were startups based in the US and Europe, and 10 years ago, they were all at the lab scale. So it was very hard to know which of these companies would be successful, which of these products would be commercial 2021, which is today. Now, before we look at the progress that these companies have made, we'll take a look at the specific type of product that you can make from CO2. So starting with concrete, building materials. Now, you can use CO2 to make a concrete product, and the way that it works is that you react carbon dioxide with a calcium or magnesium compound to form a calcium carbonate, and you can see the formula for the calcium carbonate here on the screen. Now, the technology is fairly simple. You don't need very high temperatures. You don't need a catalyst. You essentially just need a reactor, a reaction vessel to be able to perform this reaction. This technology today is available at a commercial scale, and typically 1 ton of concrete material will be able to contain around 0.1 to 0.4 ton of CO2 material. Now, what are the advantages of this technology? Now, it's very important to note that for concrete, it is the only technology, the only CO2 utilization technology where the product that you get from CO2 is actually better than the product that you can make from conventional methods. What I mean by that is that when you use CO2 to cure the wet concrete mix to form your CO2-based concrete, that CO2-based concrete will have a higher performance, higher strength than the regular Portland cement-based concrete. And this is very important because you can then leverage this performance advantage to ask for a higher price for your concrete product. So in a way, that advantage offsets the higher cost of production from CO2 rather than conventional methods. The other big advantage is that once the CO2 is in the concrete product, it is locked indefinitely in the concrete. It will not escape the concrete. So this technology is essentially an alternative to CO2 sequestration because the CO2 is locked in the material indefinitely. However, there are challenges with the technology. The main challenges is around the regulation and the acceptance of the concrete product in the broader industry. Now, today, the construction industry is very conservative for good reason. It's all around the safety. If you introduce a new concrete material in the mix, then they need to make sure that that concrete material is safe to be used and is safe to be used over the next 30, 50, even 100 years, because that's how long building lasts. So that industry is very conservative, and it will take a while before they accept a new CO2-based concrete into their mix. And also today, there are no regulations for low carbon concrete. Even though the concrete industry is seeking to decarbonize, we are still missing strong regulatory promoters for the adoption of low carbon solution in the industry. Now, how do you get over these challenges? There are ways to do so. And Carbon Cure is a company that is doing so. Now, Carbon Cure, they use CO2 to cure wet concrete mix. Now, the company is a startup. They have less than 100 employees. So it's very hard for them to convince their market, the construction industry, to change their ways. So what they're doing is that rather than going at it alone, Carbon Cure goes to the market, they find the local partners, the local cement producers, and together with these producers, they approach the regulatory board and then start the approval process for the CO2-based concrete. And that strategy has worked very well for Carbon Cure. They were formed in the early 2010s, and in just 10 years, they managed to deploy the system at over 300 plants globally, mostly in Canada and the US, but just recently, they are now penetrating the Asian market through Singapore. So this is very important for Carbon Cure. Partnering with local players allows the company to overcome the regulatory barriers as well as the barriers to adoption when it comes to a new concrete product. Now, the second product that you can make from CO2 is a chemical, and this is today the most active area of innovation when it comes to CO2 utilization. Now, in the chemical industry, there are different chemicals that you can make from CO2. These tend to be very simple C1 molecules, such as syngas, carbon monoxide, methanol, which you can see on your screen, but you can also make ethanol or ethylene, for example. Now, this technology is today at a very early stage, at the lab scale to the pilot scale, depending on the molecule that you're making. And the reason why it's so hard to scale the technology is because you need a lot of energy to drive this process forward. And depending on the chemical that you're making, you can capture up to 1.5 tons of CO2 per ton of chemical. Now, what is the advantage around this technology? As I mentioned earlier, this technology is the most active area of innovation, and the main industry that is driving innovation in this space is, as you can imagine, the chemical industry. Now, why is that? The chemical industry today is reliant on carbon as a feedstock, and that industry is getting that carbon from the oil and gas industry, from fossil crude or from natural gas. Now, in the future, the chemical industry needs to decarbonize, but it's very hard for them to decarbonize when they will still need carbon to make things like methanol or polymers for plastics and so on. So for them, they cannot eliminate carbon from their operations. What they need to do is to find an alternative source of carbon. Now, that alternative source can be biomass. Of course, you can get renewable carbon from biomass, but biomass is available in limited supply. An unlimited alternative source of carbon is CO2, because CO2 is widely available. So this is why the chemical industry is driving the innovation in that space. But there are many challenges with making chemicals from CO2. You need a lot of energy, and because you want your chemical to be renewable, that energy also has to be renewable, so you need a lot of renewable electricity for this process. Now, you cannot use carbon on its own. You need to combine it with something. And for the chemical industry, you need to combine it with hydrogen. Now again, if you want your chemical to be renewable, that hydrogen needs to be renewable, so you need to be using green hydrogen. So to make this work, you need a large supply of cheap renewable energy as well as cheap green hydrogen. Secondly, there is no regulations promoting the use of low-carbon chemicals in the industry today. Now, despite the fact that the chemical industry wants to decarbonize, you're still missing these targeted regulations, this carbon credit, to incentivize the adoption of that technology. And finally, the chemicals that you make from CO2, syngas, methanol, ethylene, ethanol, and so on, these are commodity chemicals, which means that they're very cheap. So you need to be able to compete on cost before you sell your chemical onto the broader market. Now, how do you overcome these challenges? One company has actually developed a technology to overcome the very big need for renewable electricity and renewable hydrogen. Now, Sunvita Factory is a company that is based in Houston in the US, and they're making ethylene from CO2 using microbes. So they have a synthetic biology platform where they engineer the microbes to be able to utilize CO2. Now, what's different with Sunvita's compared to their competitors using catalytic technologies or electrolysis technologies is that the microbe can get the hydrogen directly from the water. So for Sunvita, they actually don't need a source of renewable electricity or green hydrogen to run their process. They only need a source of CO2. So this is a very unique in the chemical industry. Today, Sunvita Factory is the only company that can overcome this green hydrogen and cheap electricity supply issue. They are the lab scale today, and just recently, the first pilot unit, together with Occidental Petroleum, an oil and gas company in the US, will come online in 2022. And the third product that you can make from CO2 is fuels. Now, if you think about it, you burn a fuel to make CO2. Here, you're trying to convert the CO2 back into a fuel product. So essentially trying to reverse the combustion process. Now, as you can imagine, reversing combustion is a very energy-intensive process, which means that for this, you need, similar as a chemical, you also need a lot of energy to make a fuel from CO2. So the types of fuel that you can make from CO2, these can be gaseous fuels like methane, attaching hydrogen to CO2 to make methane, but you can also make more complicated molecules like a liquid fuel such as diesel or jet fuel. Now, in the production of fuel from CO2, you actually need a lot of CO2 to make that fuel, especially when you're looking at long-chain hydrocarbons like diesel, gasoline, or jet fuel. So in this case here, 1 ton of fuel will allow you to use up to 6 tons of CO2. Now, what is the advantage of this technology? Why are people developing these platforms? It's really because of the aviation sector. Now, fuel today is used in road transportation, in the marine industry, and in the aviation sector. This is what we run our vehicles on. Now, when it comes to road transportation, as I mentioned earlier, decarbonization will be driven by electricity or hydrogen, so you won't need the diesel there. When it comes to the marine sector, you have a lot of options to decarbonize, biofuels, methanol, ammonia, even hydrogen, for example. But when it comes to the aviation sector, the options are very limited. Now, today, airplanes run on fossil jet fuel. They can replace that fossil jet fuel with biojet fuel, but biomass is limited in supply, so you won't be able to run your entire aviation sector on just biojet fuel, which means that you need an alternative. You cannot run your plane on electricity. We don't have the technology to do so. You also cannot run a plane on hydrogen. We don't yet have the technology to do so. So in this case here, using a hydrocarbon fuel made from CO2 is really the only option today for the aviation sector to decarbonize, which is why today most of the synthetic fuel projects, so projects making fuel from CO2, are making a CO2-based jet fuel that they can sell to the aviation sector. Now, in terms of challenges, very similar to the chemical industry, you need a lot of energy, and this has to be renewable. If you want your fuel to be renewable, you need a lot of green hydrogen. You have regulations to incentivize adoption of low carbon fuel, But CO2-based fuels are not widely accepted in those regulatory frameworks yet. So there's still work that needs to be done to incentivize adoption of CO2-based fuel from a regulatory perspective. And finally, many of these CO2 to fuels projects are using CO2 captured directly from air, because this ensures that you have a very low carbon footprint for your fuel. The problem is that capturing CO2 from air, which is also known as direct air capture, is very expensive, and it's unlikely that the cost will come down anytime soon, which means that your fuel ends up being very expensive. Now, how do you overcome at least one of these challenges? Ineratech, a startup in Germany, is doing so with the upcoming commercial project. Now, Ineratech has a technology to convert CO2 and hydrogen into a liquid jet fuel. Now, the company is actually using CO2 from biogas rather than capturing CO2 directly from the air. Now, CO2 from biogas is biogenic, which means that the CO2 is carbon neutral. So the CO2 from the biogas is actually has the same carbon footprint as the CO2 captured from air, except that capturing CO2 from biogas is much, much cheaper than capturing CO2 directly from air. So over here, rather than relying on an expensive source of CO2, Ineratech actually uses a cheap source of CO2, which means that its fuel will be cheaper than that of its competitors. And the first commercial scale facility will come online in 2022 in Germany. Now, looking at another product, this is the polymer space. You can also make a polymer from CO2, and polymer tends to be a very complicated molecule, as you can see here on the slide. But here, despite the fact that it's a complex molecule, making a polymer from CO2 is actually commercial. Now, why is that? The process of converting CO2 into a polymer, so you react the CO2 with an epoxide to make a polymer, you actually don't need a lot of energy for this, and you also don't need a large amount of hydrogen. And the catalysts are also commercially ready. So the technology itself is commercial. You already have commercial facilities from SAIC in Japan and Covestro running this technology. Now, you can also make a bio-based polymer known as polyhydroxyalkanoate. This is made using microbes, but that technology is very much at the lab scale. Now, depending on the polymer chain that you're making, you can capture up to 2 tons of CO2 per ton of polymer. Now, what are the drivers for making polymers from CO2? Now, a CO2-based polycarbonate is biodegradable, which is a very important advantage that other fossil-based polymers do not have. So this is a driving factor for making polymers from CO2. And also, the polymer market is evolving. You have applications that require high-performing polyurethane polymers for their operations, and you can make polyurethane from CO2, assuming you have a polycarbonate polyol. So you have the market demand that is driving the adoption, development of this technology. In terms of barriers, today the polymer industry, despite the fact that they want to decarbonize, they still do not have concrete regulations and credit to drive the adoption of low-carbon polymer in the broader space. And also, when it comes to CO2-based polymer, you don't make a final polymer molecule directly from the CO2. You're making a polymer intermediate, a polycarbonate polyol, which is an intermediate, which means that you also need to develop the downstream application for your new CO2-based polymer. So this is a challenge, and this is a challenge that Covestro has overcome. Covestro, they're very large material companies. They have the resources to develop this downstream process for polymers. And you can see here that they launched a commercial scale CO2 polyol intermediate facility in 2016. And Covestro also developed the downstream product that are made from this polymer. So now Covestro is selling binders and foam material, final foam and binder material directly to the customer. And these products are made from a CO2-based polymer. Now, the second to last category is solid carbon. So this is very interesting. Over here, what you're doing is you're stripping away the oxygen from the carbon atom. You're essentially left with just solid carbon material. And that solid carbon material can be very simple, like carbon black, but it can be more complex structures like carbon nanotube or carbon nanofibers, for example. Now, this technology requires a lot of energy, as you can imagine, taking away the oxygen from the carbon, and it is today at the laboratory scale. But to make a solid carbon material, you need a lot of CO2. So depending on the material that you're making, you can utilize up to 4 tons of CO2 gas per ton of solid carbon material that you're making. Now, what is driving the development in this industry? Carbon nanomaterial today in particular, this is not a commercial space, not just for CO2, but for any type of carbon nanomaterial, which means that you already have a price premium that you can command for this carbon nanomaterial. Now, making a carbon nanomaterial from CO2 is more expensive, as you can imagine. It's a lab scale technology, but because the market is ready to accept a more expensive material, then you can already command a price premium for your product. In terms of barriers, you require a lot of energy to do so. The application for carbon additives is not yet commercial, which means you won't be able to readily sell it onto the market. You need to find a targeted application, and you need to work directly with the customer on this product. The technology is still at a lab scale. There are still questions revolving around the quality of the carbon nanomaterial that you're making from CO2. And there's also a lot of uncertainty around the scale-up of the process because there are not many companies around the world developing this technology. So the scale-up of this technology is very reliant on 2-3 companies driving forward the development of this technology. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges with carbon nanomaterial is that you need to find an application for your material before you start building your technology, building your facility. And this is what C2CNT, a startup based in Canada, is doing. C2CNT has an electrochemical technology for making carbon nanotubes from CO2. They're very much at the pilot scale today, and they're looking to build the first commercial scale facility. But before they build that facility, they already intend to sell that carbon nanomaterial to the concrete industry as an additive. So they already found the target application for their carbon nanotube, which means that they can tailor their nanotube specifically to that industry. And this provides a lot more security to potential investors into their project. And finally, the last product that you can make from CO2 is proteins. Now over here, this is very interesting. This is also a very exotic application of CO2 utilization that has emerged over the past 2-3 years. What you're doing here is that you're feeding CO2 and hydrogen to a microbial mixture to make a solid protein material. And that protein can then be used for animal food, but also for human nutrition. Well, the technology today is still at the early stage, at the pilot scale, but the first commercial scale facility are likely to come online in the next 3 to 5 years. And for proteins, you need around 0.7 to 1 ton of CO2 for every ton of protein that you're making. Now, what is driving forward the development in that space? It's really market-based. Now, the demand for fish meal, so animal feed proteins, is increasing. And today, you're getting fish meal from aquaculture, which is not enough to meet the demand, which is why there is a large demand for alternatives for proteins. And CO2-based protein is one such alternative. So the market for alternative proteins is actually growing. So you have a growing market for your CO2-based proteins. And also, there's a lot of concerns today around the environmental footprint, the environmental costs of protein production for animal feed, which is again driving the development of alternative proteins, including CO2-based protein. Now, in terms of challenges, similar to chemicals and fuel, when it comes to making a protein from CO2, you also need a source of hydrogen. But it's not such a big challenge because that hydrogen does not actually have to be renewable. Because unlike chemical and fuel, where you want your chemical and fuel to be renewable, protein, no one really cares if your protein is renewable or not because it is used for animal feed, which means that you can actually use hydrogen from natural gas, which is much cheaper than green hydrogen. And the other barrier is the fact that the technology is at the lab scale. You can't simply make a protein from CO2 and sell it directly onto the market. You need to get regulatory approval for your protein from a safety perspective. Now, it's easier to do so with the animal feed industry, but if you're targeting human nutrition, then it can be a very long process, taking more than 5 years before you get regulatory approval. Now, how do you overcome one such challenge? Novo Nutrients is doing so with its product. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are two markets that you can target, animal feed and human nutrition. While many of the protein companies, CO2-based protein companies, are targeting human nutrition, Novo Nutrients is actually targeting the animal feed sector. Now, animal feed has less regulatory restrictions for new types of protein, which means that Novo Nutrients will be able to enter the market faster than its competitors. Now, the company is still at a pilot scale. The first commercial scale facility will come online by 2025 in the US, and they will be using hydrogen from natural gas. So this was an overview of all the different products that you can make from CO2, as well as the promoters and the challengers that you get with each specific product. Now let's go back 10 years in the past. Now, 10 years ago, as I showed you earlier, many companies were formed to commercialize CO2 utilization technologies, and back then, all of them were at a lab scale. So if 10 years ago I were to ask you which of these companies would be successful, it would be hard for you to say so. Now you have a better idea, given that we just walked through the overview of CO2 utilization technologies. But fundamentally, what is the challenge with CO2 utilization? Now, CO2 as a molecule is very stable, and converting that molecule into something else is not so easy, as we've seen before. But there are two types of ways that you can convert a CO2 molecule. Now, there's a reason why I showed you all of these different product molecules that you can make from CO2, and you can see all of them here on this slide. Now, what I want you to do here is to find where the CO2 molecule ended up in each product. And I'll make it easy for you. I'll highlight the CO2 molecule. Now, what you can see here is actually quite interesting. In the case of concrete and polymer, you can see that the CO2 molecule is actually intact. We never broke the CO2 molecule. Instead, we built around the molecule. You just attach new things to that molecule. And if you're not breaking the CO2 molecule, you don't need a lot of energy, you don't need a lot of hydrogen, and in some cases, you don't even need a catalyst to do so. But if you look at chemicals, fuels, carbon, and protein, you can see that here, you're breaking that CO2 molecule. Now, CO2 is very stable, and if you want to break it, you need a lot of energy, you need a lot of hydrogen, and in all cases, you also need a catalyst to accelerate the reaction. So this is really why, when it comes to concrete and polymer, these applications are commercial, whereas for the other products, you're still very much at the lab scale. So if I go back to the timeline, 2010, everyone was at the lab scale. We jump forward 5 years, you can see that companies in concrete and polymers have progressed from the lab scale to the demo scale, whereas all the other companies are still very much stuck in the lab. And if we jump forward 6 years to today, in 2021, you can see that companies in concrete and polymers have successfully scaled to the commercial scale, while everyone else is still stuck at the lab scale. It is precisely for that reason, making concrete and polymer from CO2 from a chemistry perspective is much easier than making a chemical, fuel, carbon, and protein. Now, what does this mean for Japan in particular? Just because concrete and polymers are the most successful application does not necessarily mean that it is the right technology for you to invest in and deploy. So let's take a look at the Japanese context and some of the constraints that you have in the country. Now, as I shown earlier, Japan releases a lot of CO2 emission. And unfortunately, for Japan, you don't have a lot of sequestration resources to bury that CO2 underground, which means that if you're looking for a CO2 utilization product to invest in, that product needs to be able to capture a lot of CO2, which means that that product needs to have a very large market size, because if there's a very small market for the CO2-based product, then you won't be able to divert much of your CO2 emissions into the production of that product. So which products have the largest market size when it comes to CO2 utilization? These are concrete, chemicals, and fuel. So if you're a company that is emitting a lot of CO2 and you need to find a sink for those CO2 emissions, then you will have to look towards concrete, chemicals, and fuel as the best options to capture all of your CO2 emission. Now, what is another constraint? Is around the long-term storage of CO2. If you don't have a sink, if you don't have resources to bury the CO2 underground, then you need to make sure that the CO2 that you convert is stored permanently in the CO2 product, which means that the CO2 needs to be locked in, even if not indefinitely, but at least for a very, very long time. So which product can actually store the CO2 for a very long time? These are concrete, polymer, and carbon. In the concrete material, the CO2 is locked indefinitely. In the polymer, it is locked for a very long time, even though it will eventually get back to the atmosphere once the polymer degrades, but it will take many decades for a polymer to do so. And for the carbon material, it's a similar story. The CO2 can eventually escape, but the carbon material first needs to degrade, and this can take decades to happen. When it comes to fuels and chemicals, despite the fact that it's a very large market that they can absorb a lot of CO2, the minute that you use a chemical or the fuel, the CO2 will go back into the atmosphere. So chemicals and fuels are not a solution for permanent storage of CO2 via utilization. Now, the last challenge, and this one is a very big challenge, is obviously the lack of renewable electricity resources in Japan, as well as the surrounding regions. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of sun, there isn't a lot of geothermal or wind in the region, which means that there is not much potential to be producing renewable electricity. Which means that you want to have a technology that does not require much energy, but also does not require much green hydrogen, because green hydrogen needs renewable electricity. Now, which technologies would those be? Once again, that would be concrete, that would be polymer. These two technologies do not require a lot of energy, and you don't need green hydrogen for these two products. But I would also include protein. As I mentioned earlier, even though you need hydrogen for protein, that hydrogen does not have to be renewable, because no one is looking for a renewable protein product yet, which means that you can use hydrogen from fossil fuel. So that allows you to overcome the lack of renewable electricity barrier that you have. So what are the key takeaways from this presentation on CO2 utilization? Firstly, if you don't have a place to store your CO2 underground, but you still need to reduce your CO2 emissions, then you need to look at other ways to use that CO2, which means that you can convert that CO2 into an array of different products. Secondly, not every technology, not every product is the same. As you've seen, some technologies such as concrete and polymers are commercial, while the others are still at a lab scale. And this is directly related to the chemistry of the technology. What do you do with that molecule? If you're building around the CO2 molecule, then you can be commercial very fast. If you're looking to break the CO2 molecule, then it will take a very long time for you to scale up successfully. And finally, you need to look at the local constraints of your market. Just because the technology is successful does not mean that it is the best option for you. In the case of Japan, for all the different constraints that I outlined earlier, concrete is really the best option for CO2 utilization, because concrete can absorb a lot of CO2. It's a very big market. The CO2 is locked indefinitely in the concrete, so you can actually use concrete as an alternative to CO2 sequestration. And you also don't need renewable electricity to make concrete from CO2. So this is the end of the presentation, and I will end on this note from the Japanese industry minister that said last year that carbon neutrality itself is a growth strategy, and we must carry it out with all that we have. And CO2 utilization will really allow you to grow new industries from your CO2 emissions. Well, thank you, everyone. And if there are any questions, feel free to ask me either in the chat or even by unmuting yourself.
Thank you so much, Renil. Just a reminder to all the audience members, we do have 2 polls up and running. You know, we'd like to get a feel for where all our attendees are in terms of your organization and your CCU strategy. And of course, you know, which one of these end products are the most attractive: polymers, concrete, fuels, proteins, chemicals, and carbon. So as previously mentioned, feel free to submit any questions into the Q&A folder, and we will get through some of those one by one. But I think, kind of to sum up everything that Renil has shared with us, you know, he's talked about sort of the very large opportunity, obviously, that's available in the CCU market, the large addressable market size, especially if you're looking at fuels, chemicals, as he mentioned, but also, more importantly, the market opportunities for CCU as a carbon sink, which I think is very key. Many of the conversations right now around decarbonization has been focused on sequestration, but the reality is sequestration is geographically limited, and therefore there has to be other avenues to store your carbon. And some of these pathways, such as concrete and others, really provide that opportunity. So with that said, we will jump into Q&A with the last few minutes here. And if Renil, you can give me a thumbs up, that audio is good, then we can get going. But if not, then Renil, I pass it to you to kind of just go through the questions that are in the Q&A box.
Right, so I'll address some of the questions that were asked in the chat. So first question is around CO2-based methanol. So the question was that the methanol from CO2 is more costly than fossil-derived methanol. Is there a demand for this e-methanol at the moment? I would say yes, but the demand for CO2-based methanol is very little today, and that demand is actually not coming from the chemical industry, but from the fuel industry. Now, as I mentioned, there are no regulations promoting the adoption of low-carbon chemical in the industry. Now, methanol today is mostly used as a chemical intermediate for formaldehyde. Now, if you're making e-methanol and you're looking to make formaldehyde from it, then you simply won't have a business case because no one is going to pay extra for that e-methanol. But if you're making methanol from CO2 and you're selling that methanol as a fuel, then you can benefit from some of the regulatory promoters credits that is available in the fuel industry. And this is what some of the companies in the space are doing. They're making methanol from CO2 and selling that methanol as a fuel for the marine industry, or they go to China and sell it over there because in China, there is actually quite a big market for methanol as a fuel. But again, your methanol in this case will be more expensive than fossil methanol, which means that you need to have the credits in the fuel industry to support the adoption. Now, another question is, what is the carbon balance for producing fuel from CO2 when the CO2 is emitted after the consumption of the fuel? Now, that is very true, and this is the reason why it's today challenging for policymakers to build regulations around CO2-based fuel, Because if you're capturing CO2 from fossil fuel combustion, converting that back into fuel and then burning the fuel, you actually did not mitigate any CO2 emissions. Instead, you just added more CO2 to the atmosphere because you need energy to convert CO2 back into a fuel. Now, from the carbon lifetime, carbon footprint perspective, you're actually adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. The logic behind making CO2 from fuel is that you're indirectly reducing emissions by reducing the need for new oil extraction. Now, if all of our CO2 is recycled back into fuel, then that will drastically reduce the need for extracting crude oil underground because you're essentially recycling, replacing the new carbon molecule with a recycled carbon molecule. So no, it will not eliminate all of your CO2 emissions, but what it will do is it will indirectly reduce the amount of new CO2 molecule that you're inputting into the atmosphere by making crude oil extraction less profitable. Now, the last question that I see here is, what is the price competitiveness of CO2-derived polymer at the moment? So we don't have specific numbers on this yet, but based on the many conversations that we've had with people in the polymer industry, it is actually quite competitive to make a polymer from CO2. Now, I wouldn't say that making a polymer from CO2 today is cheaper than making a polymer from fossil resources, but from what we've heard, it's very close to price parity, which is why Covestro in Germany, they built the commercial scale facility. Now that facility has a capacity of 5,000 metric tons per year, and they're looking to build a 100,000 metric ton per year facility in the near future. It's also why SAIC, I believe it's already been 10 years now that they built the commercial scale facility in Japan, and they also licensed the technology to other commercial facilities in China as well. Now, even though they did not disclose the costs of their CO2-based polymer, they wouldn't have expanded commercially unless that CO2-based polymer was very close to cost parity with fossil-based polymer. Now, I believe that I addressed most of the questions that were asked in the chat. So if there are any more questions, then feel free to email us. Otherwise, I will pass it on to Yuansheng, who will then wrap up the presentation.
Thank you, Renil. I really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you so much for joining our Lux Executive Briefing today. And as you saw in the chat box, at the end of this event, you will be getting an email with the slides and the recording of the session today by Renil. And please, 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 in that email, there will be a link to a feedback survey. Your feedback is very important to us as we plan to host many more of these events over the course of the rest of this year and next year as well. So please take a few minutes out of your time to submit your feedback to us. And with that, I thank everyone for joining with us today, and hope you found the presentation insightful and informative, and wish you all a good day.